In this episode of Toy Time, Miss Brown, the 2017 Charter School Teacher of the Year, will teach you all about the different types of irony.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deborah Brown, and I'm currently an administrator at the Explorer School in downtown Raleigh. But before that, I was an English teacher for about 25 years. So today's lesson online is for you to get an example of the literary technique of irony, particularly how it's used in literature. And this is going to be really useful for you, not just if you're doing literary analysis and looking at an author's rhetoric, but also if you're a writer and you want to try incorporating some of these techniques on your own. Now, there are three main types of irony that you'll find in literature, but the overall definition that you see on your screen. Irony is a literary technique when an author is creating a difference between the perceived and the actual meaning. And if you take a look at our friend over here, the bird, who is sitting on top of a sign that says no birds. So there's your difference between the perceived meaning and the actual meaning. Now, irony usually comes in three different flavors, three different types that you can find. And the first is verbal, the second is situational irony, and finally, dramatic irony. And we're going to break down each one of these types with examples in the next slides. Now, the first type of irony that we're going to take a look at is verbal irony. And verbal irony is pretty much when you're saying things out loud in a certain way. Uh, Most of you in high school are pretty familiar with things like sarcasm. This is when you're saying the opposite of what you mean. These are the kinds of comments that will often get you in trouble with the adults around you. But there's different types of that too. It can be broken up into understatement. That's when you're saying something really is less than it is, like you're trying to say something's no big deal when really it is a big deal, or even overstatement when you're saying something is way more important than it really is. And again, we'll show you a few examples of both of these types. So let's talk first about a type of verbal irony, specifically understatement. So many of you may have read Romeo and Juliet, and there's a moment in kind of a famous line where Mercutio is fatally stabbed, and he knows it, but he's still trying to joke around with his friends. And he says, "No, 'tis not so deep as a well, nor so wide as a church door, but 'tis enough 'twill serve. Ask for me tomorrow, and you shall find me a grave man." And of course, he's making a pun on the word grave here too, being both serious but also being dead. But there's an example where he's trying to say, no, it's not that big deal, but we know that it, and he knows that it's actually a fatal injury. And if you look at the picture here, where you have the sign that says water on pavement, but it's clearly completely flooded out, there's another example of understatement. So understatement, again, is a type of verbal irony where you're saying that something is less than it really is, but you're saying the opposite of what you mean. Another type of verbal irony and sarcasm is overstatement. And this is overstatement when you're kind of mocking something sometimes by making it seem to be a bigger or more important than it actually is. Now, overstatement is connected to hyperbole. Hyperbole is another literary term where you have an extreme exaggeration, usually for comic effect, but the two can be connected. So when you're saying things like, I just about died when I learned how much homework I was going to have, or my parents are going to kill me, or even the classic, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse, that's a series of overstatement, and that would be a type of verbal irony. Now, out of all of the forms of irony, situational irony is probably both the most common and maybe the most difficult to come to a specific definition of what we mean. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples and a couple ways to think about situational irony. The first is that it's when something happens that's the opposite of what was expected to happen. The second way to think about it is a situation where the actions have an impact, they have an effect that's the opposite from what was intended or expected and anticipated. And the third is this idea of a reversal of expectations. Again, you're getting the sense that you expected one thing to happen, but then various things in the situation created something very different. And I'm going to show you a series of examples of situational irony. Now, the first example of situational irony comes from this picture of this tattoo, which reads, "When writing the story of your life, don't let anyone else hold the pen." But do you get what's the opposite here? Because clearly this is on her back. There's no way that she wrote this herself. Clearly someone else was indeed holding the pen in order to write this in the tattoo. So here's your first example of situational irony. Now, here's another example of situational irony. This is supposed to be a product that stops rust, but if you look, there's very clearly rust that has not been stopped on the outside of its own can. So again, situational irony, the opposite of what you would have expected. Yet another example of situational irony, the procrastinator's meeting has been postponed. Well, to be a procrastinator would be to postpone things. Now, as an English teacher, I really loved this one. This is Lakewood High School advertising its Leaping to Literacy Night. But if you'll notice, there's a typo, a misspelling of the word leaping, and a program that's supposed to be about literacy, which is increasing your reading and writing skills. Now let's look at some of the ways that authors have used situational irony in some well-known pieces of literature. So for example, in Fahrenheit 451, the firemen are not the people who are putting out fires, they're actually the people who are starting the fires by burning the books. In Life of Pi, we have a survival story where a boy is lost at sea, but the situational irony is that in his boat is a man-eating tiger. Then we have the example in Romeo and Juliet where Romeo's trying to keep the peace, and ironically, by trying to separate the people who are fighting, it's actually how his friend ends up getting killed. And then O. Henry's Gift of the Magi may be one of the most famous examples in literature of situational irony, where the husband and wife each try to give each other a gift by selling the thing that's most precious to them, and then realizing that the gifts that they had given are no longer something that they'll be able to use. And now we're going to move to another type of irony, and that is dramatic irony. And this is one of my favorite techniques that authors will use. Now, dramatic irony is when the author has set up a situation so that the reader or a character in the story knows something that the other characters don't. And this is a way of creating foreshadowing and suspense. So if you look at this cartoon, this little visual we have here, we have our prisoner who is tunneling out of the jail cell, and what he doesn't know is that what he's about to tunnel into is where is the outhouse. So the audience, when we look at that, we see that and we get, oh, we know exactly what's going to happen. But this poor guy does not know what is about to hit him. Now let's look at some examples of dramatic irony as it's used in literature. In Romeo and Juliet, the suspense comes at the very end because the audience knows that Juliet is not really dead, that she's just taken the sleeping potion, but Romeo has no idea. So as the audience is watching this story unfold, they are setting up this suspense and this feeling of tension to see if Romeo is going to discover it. In Oedipus, he doesn't know that he is the man that he seeks, that Oedipus is actually the killer that he thinks he's out to be the detective to discover. But the audience is very much aware of this fact. And again, that's where the suspense comes in throughout the whole story. If you remember your story from The Lion King, it's Scar, but not Simba, who's responsible for Mufasa's death. But Simba spends most of the story not knowing that he wasn't the one who caused his father to fall from that cliff and to be killed. And then almost any horror story that you watch, this is classic, right? We as the audience know where the killer is and know where they're hiding, but the heroine has no idea. And it's again that contrast between what the audience knows and what the characters in the story know that sets up this kind of fear and suspense that makes this such a great technique to use for writers. Next, I want to talk about some formats that are related to irony, but do have their own distinct definitions. So the first is parody, and the second is satire. Now, these are both, again, related types of irony. What they're doing is they're copying either the form of a genre or a style, and they're either trying to mock it or to draw attention to how ridiculous it is or how elements of that format might be ridiculous. Parody and satire could be a short part of something, or they might be an entire work of their own. And they often keep the form of the original, but then change up things to create that irony, to create that parody or that satire. And you're familiar with these. If you've ever seen any example of a Saturday Night Live sketch, for example, where they do an opening skit that looks like a press conference, so it's mocking that format, but it's making fun of it and showing you how ridiculous things might be in there. If you ever had a copy of Mad Magazine or have ever seen any of the cartoons or pieces from that, the entire Mad Magazine was a type of parody. George Orwell's Animal Farm, in and of itself, is a type of parody and satire. Monty Python, The Holy Grail, or The Colbert Report, which was on for years, that mocked out the idea of a traditional news show, talking host and everything, with lots of jokes. And if you look at the format on the screen, the Goodnight iPad is making fun of the familiar format and genre of the Goodnight Moon series. Now, if anyone's a fan of 90s music, you've probably heard Alanis Morissette's song called Ironic. And what's ironic about Alanis Morissette's song Ironic is that most of the examples that she gives are actually not ironic. They're just sort of unfortunate. So she mentions a black fly in your Chardonnay. It's like, okay, you've got a glass of wine and a bug gets into it. That's not really terrifically unexpected. It's just kind of nasty. Or a traffic jam if you're already late. Again, it's unfortunate, but it's not an ironic situation. A lot of times when you are late, it's because there is traffic. Or the line that she gives from the song, it's like rain on your wedding day. It might be a coincidence that it rains on your wedding day. It might be bad timing that it rains on your wedding day. It might be bad luck, but is it ironic? No. So apologies to Alanis, but most of the examples in your song, Ironic, are not actually examples of irony. So, in conclusion, irony can be a great tool in the hand of an author. It can be used to highlight flaws in their characters or in society at large. It can be used as a characterization technique to show you the kind of sense of humor that a character might have. And it can be used to create a lot of suspense to make you want to keep watching the story to see when the character figures out what the audience already knows. So, look for these three types of irony in the literature that you're studying and in the world all around. And also, check out the comments on the side for a way that you can take a test, a little quiz for yourself on this topic from today on this video, and also some things that you can do to extend or enrich your study of the literary technique of irony. Hope you're all doing well. Keep studying, keep reading. Bye now.